Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Other Local History, Unremembered Stories of Slavery in Cheshire. This presentation is hosted by the Cheshire Coalition for Change and the Cheshire High School Rams Against Racism. My name is Kaya O'Donnell.
And I'm Veronica Cadavid.
And we're going to be your hosts for tonight. We'd like to thank everyone here for attending and taking the time to learn more about the often unforgotten history of Cheshire. To begin, we'd like to acknowledge who is organizing this event and giving this presentation today. While the CCC is made up of Cheshire Public School alumni of all backgrounds, our mission is to prioritize and uplift Black voices in the community. This means we must examine each of our own biases, and again, we commend each of you, whether this is your first step or a continuation of anti-bias and anti-racist efforts. Rams Against Racism is a CHS club that is led by students for students. They strive to create a safe space for students of various backgrounds, and they also provide the tools and resources for facilitating healthy discourse and race and culture to create necessary change in our community. While we're here, we'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous lands on which Cheshire currently sits. We are Wappinger and Quinnipiac lands, and we encourage you to read further about these Indigenous peoples who stewarded the land we will be discussing today for many generations prior to colonization.
Our guest speaker today is Christine Pitsley. She's a third-generation Cheshire resident, mother, veteran, and self-professed history geek. She began studying slavery in Connecticut more than 15 years ago with a focus on New Haven County. She has extensively researched and documented the African and African descent communities of the 17th and 18th centuries. When not studying local history, Christine studies World War I and is currently the project director for Connecticut State Library's World War I programs. She has been Connecticut's liaison to the United States World War I Centennial Commission and has been recognized as a leader in the nation's commemorative efforts. She has worked at the State Library for 12 years, where she created and led the archival and museum digitization and metadata programs. She has been involved in a number of statewide digital initiatives and is currently working with the Concerned Parents of Color of West Hartford and Yukon Community Leader in Residence program, and sits on the Connecticut Militia Heritage Council. She has also served on boards of the Association for the Study of Connecticut History, Cheshire Historical Society, and Cheshire Historic District Commission. On behalf of RAR and the CCC, we welcome Christine Pitsley.
Hi, everybody. I am really glad to be here tonight. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, as anyone who knows me can tell you. And it's a topic that we really don't talk about. I grew up here, my mom grew up here, and my grandmother grew up here, and it's not a topic that any of us ever learned about. I grew up going to the First Congregational Church where there are slave pews, and it never even dawned on me that that meant that there were slaves in Cheshire. So tonight we're gonna kind of take a broad overview of what was happening here in Cheshire. So first I wanted to put out a few notes about terminology. I do not use the word slave. Slave is a very passive term. It doesn't really tell you anything about that person. Master is the same way. That's just not an okay term. And enslaved and enslaver are still a little passive. I actually prefer, and was taught by my mentor, Dr. Warren Perry at CCSU, to use the word captive, because that's what these people were. They were captives. And the people that held them were captors. And the same goes runaway. Runaway is kind of means that you've done something wrong and you're running from that. So I tend to use escapee, because fugitive slave is also has a criminal overtone to it. And then there's the distinction between African American and Black. In terms of the early Africans that were brought here, I don't call them African Americans because they were African. I go between African descent and African American for later generations because they weren't actually given American citizenship. They weren't counted as full citizens of our nation. So I go back and forth between that. what I encourage people to do is, as you move forward in your life, when you read something about slavery, swap out those words, because it will change how you approach this subject. One other warning: there are some disturbing stories and images in this presentation. They are not there to offend anyone. I feel very strongly that we need to use language that conveys the truth about what this really is. For a long time, I minimized some of my language. I used language that made my audience feel comfortable, my white audience. So tonight, if you get uncomfortable, please know I'm not intending for you to be uncomfortable, but it's not a bad thing if you're uncomfortable. That said, this is the point that if you were a live audience, I would be asking how many of you actually knew that slavery happened here in Connecticut. And some of our first documented Africans were here by 1639, up in Hartford and New Haven. In our particular area, the first African that we know of was a man named Abijah Prince. He was the servant of Reverend Benjamin Doolittle, and he was, quote, born in Wallingford about 1706. He later moved to Vermont and was freed. By 1774, there's records of more than 6,500 captives in Connecticut. And these are just the written records that we have in a census that was done in 1774. However, my research has shown that there were far more Africans and African Americans in Connecticut than that. They show up in probate records. They show up in church records, people that should be in those census records that are not. By the time the 1790 census comes around, it shows that we have 51 African and African descendant people here in Cheshire. And again, that number is far lower than it actually was. So some of the first African peoples that we know of in Cheshire, and I do call them African because it is so early on, are recorded in the records of the Reverend Samuel Hall. As you can see, his handwriting was absolutely atrocious, but he recorded that from 1734 to 1737, 37 whites and 2 blacks had died. And from 1726 to 1737, 101 whites and 6 blacks had died, which meant between 1726 and 1734, there were 4 African people. Now, some of them had names, some of them were adults, and a few of them were children. He mentions in I believe this is 32, a Negro man named Sambo died, as well as a Negro child. And throughout his records, and even the pastor who came after him, John Foote, people are marked out just simply as a Negro child or a Negro wench, a Negro man. They weren't given the dignity of a name. Another one of the early African-American people in town is really the person who started this off for me, and that's Prince Freeman. He is one of the few people that has a headstone at the cemetery, as you can see. This is an old picture. They've actually put it upright again. And he, I believe, was the captive of Reverend John Foote. And you can see here the text of the bill of sale for Prince, who was sold to John Foote at the age of 8. So he came here from Branford at the age of 8 without his parents. Prince, like I said, inspired me. He was the first person when I started doing this research that I found, and I became kind of attached to his family. There's a story, there's a historian here in town. His name was Edwin R. Brown, who has this great manuscript of about 2 large volumes or 6 small volumes of his knowledge about the town. He had grown up here, and he goes street by street, telling house by house, telling you who lived there and stories about them. And when he came to Prince's family, and he would have known James and Henry, he tells this story here. James and Henry, who were twins, were born. Curiosity led a good many from all parts of the town to visit this place and take a look at the colored twin babies. So they would have lived up near Schoolhouse Road. They had a house up there. And he goes on to say that Henry, his being Henry, mother, was stolen from the west coast of Africa. She left a husband and 2 children and went down to the river to wash as usual. She was taken and brought to this country and never heard of again, or never heard again of her family that she left behind. This was Prince's second wife, named Pad. I know she was married here. I know that she was married to Prince. We have those records. There's no record of her death, and that was not uncommon. So she is probably buried in Hillside alongside her first husband or her husband, but there's unfortunately no way of proving that. The Freemans went on a couple more generations. There are actually descendants of this family still in the area. So one of the things that I think we don't do a good job at here in New England is recognizing captive economy. And we tend to think that because we didn't have plantations like this photo or this drawing, we didn't have these large scale plantations, the things that we think of when we think of slavery in the South, that, you know, we weren't benefiting economically. And a lot of the history that's been done kind of minimizes the impact of slavery in the North. But just because we don't have those large scale plantations didn't mean that Connecticut didn't benefit economically, and that Cheshire didn't benefit economically from captive labor. Captive men, women, and children in Cheshire kept house, they cooked, they farmed, they made potash, they did much of the manual labor that their captors didn't do. So as a demonstration, so Cheshire and the West Indies trade, and these are all people that actually lived here in town. Nathan Gaylord grows corn. Corn is dried in General Hull's kiln. It's ground at Huff's mill. Josiah Talmadge, who was a cooper, made the barrels to hold the corn. And then the corn is stored in Matthew Bellamy's warehouse until it was ready to ship, which is then shipped to the West Indies on Squire Andrew Hull's ship. It's traded for sugar and molasses produced by captive labor in the West Indies. It's brought back here and sold in Rufus Hitchcock's store. And then Anne Atwater Gaylord buys sugar and molasses to bake her husband Nathan a cake. So every farmer here in town, every cooper, every miller, everyone was benefiting from captive labor, whether it was here in town or in the West Indies. And that was a huge deal here in New England. It really, that economy built the New England that we now live in. As Harriet Beecher Stowe had said once, all of the benefits and none of the screams. Brown, the historian I had mentioned, tells a lot of anecdotal stories. So one of them that he told was about a man named George Thrall, who lived with Squire Hull for several years. Now, Squire Hull lived over on Country Club Road in the old, what I think, in the spot that I think is now the old clubhouse for the country club that was on Country Club Road. So George Thrall lived there with Squire Hull for several years, and it was his nature to be full of fun. At this time, a Negro youth also lived with Squire Hull, and lived with as being very politically correct. He was enslaved by Squire Hull. One day, the squire purchased in the center an empty molasses hogshead barrel and had left it at the head of the lane near the house. So that's that kind of hill that goes around the corner there. George saw a good opportunity for some fun, and getting the hogshead in a position to suit him at the top of the hill, he urged the Negro to go inside and partake of some of the sugar that was still clinging to the bottom. The Negro did not need much urging. He went inside, commenced his meal, and seemed oblivious to all surroundings. George, at this point, gave the hogshead a sharp roll, and down the hill it went, Negro and all. When the Negro made his exit from the hogshead, his face and hands were covered with blood caused by the sharp nails inside, and his entire person was well covered with sugar and molasses. This was fun for the boys, but misery for the Negro. Those are Brown's own words. And, that kind of gives you a perspective on, number one, how African Americans were treated here in Cheshire. And, this was probably kind of par for the course for most of the country at that point in time. And this probably would have been in the 1790s, early 1800s. But it also speaks to how Edwin R. Brown approached this subject. He's writing this in 1892. And to him, this is, boys will be boys. This is all good fun. But nobody really cared about the feelings of this poor African-American boy. Now imagine today if you heard of that happening to anyone, never mind it being an African-American boy. If something like that happened today, it would make national news because it's horrific, but it was just accepted as part of life 100 years ago. Oh, I forgot I had added that. So another piece of this is that enslavement was institutionalized by the law. In 1702, an act was passed to create a financial incentive not to free captives. If you freed a captive and they later came to want, they became poor and they needed help, needed to go to the town poor farm, your heirs, executors, or administrators would be held financially responsible for their care. That provided captors an incentive not to free captives. The law was later amended that only captives between the ages of, I think it was 21 and 45 could be freed, and they had to be in good physical condition, able to work and support themselves, and had to be examined by the town subscribers. Again, this became a mechanism to keep people enslaved. One of Thaddeus Cook, who Cook Hill Road comes from, his family, his father, and then Thaddeus owned somewhere between 5 and 10 Africans at any given time. And one of the captives that they held, a man named Caesar, probably died enslaved because he was too old. By the time that law was passed, he was too old to be manumitted under those rules. So that's part of the reason that slavery was still in effect here in Connecticut till 1848. Slavery was not actually abolished in this state until then because of some of these laws. So there were also a number of what were called slave codes. These were legal frameworks for controlling every aspect of a captive's life. If you were a captive or a free person of color, if you were African American, if you were Native American, you were not allowed to be out without a pass after 9 o'clock at night. You were not allowed to take a ferry without permission from your captor. If you were caught stealing something, you were liable to more punishment than a white person. So there were all sorts of these laws that kept being passed to further and further restrict what a free or enslaved African could or couldn't do. And these even played a part into where you could go. There wasn't a lot of movement in the colonial period for anybody. It's not like today. People couldn't just get up and, I'm going to go move to Hartford because, I want to. You had to be accepted into a town. You had to be able to support yourself. And that's as a white person. As an African-American, you could not do that. You could not get up and move. There were cases where it happened. There are lots of legal cases where, someone was freed, they moved to another town, and they were warned out of town. The town subscribers said, no, you can't be here. And so these codes were really a way of controlling a population. And that population was merchandise. I think that's something that we really have to keep in mind, is that as much as many historians like to think that, here in New England, when slavery did exist, it was benign, it was mild, it was, everybody was part of the family. There was a woman, Sarah Kimball Knight, who in the early 1700s, 1740s, I think it was, traveled from Rhode Island to New York. And she stopped at different places along the way. And at some point in Connecticut, she stopped and made a comment about how the house where she was staying, that the servants, the Black servants, were allowed to eat at the table with the white folks. And so that has been used for 200 years to talk about how good how good captives in New England had it. It's not quite so good. People were sold to each other. This is a bill of sale from Thaddeus Cook for, let's see, I did not get my notes, for a girl named Zilpha, who was about 12 years old here in Cheshire. This one is Joseph Hall, who we'll talk about in a little while, for a boy named Philip, who was about 10 years old. Oh, I thought I had one more. People were sold constantly here in Connecticut. You would see sales also in the newspapers. Captain Enos Atwater here in Cheshire was having some financial troubles and selling a lot of his goods, including a good Negro wench about 20 years old. One of the other ads that you will see are also a method of control, and those are runaway notices. The top one here on the right is for a girl named Tamar, about 20 years old, who had run away from John Foote. He held not only Prince, but also this woman named Tamar. And he had a whole host of problems with the church because he had kind of rented her out to someone in, I think it was Woodbury. The Doolittles also owned a few captives, including this 40-year-old named Guinea. And so there's a story in Landmarks of Cheshire about a young boy who had escaped, and you'll see these all say run away, from Charles Chauncey Hall, who lived up on Maple Ave. And in Landmarks of Cheshire, they jest that, oh, it was only a $2 reward, so, it probably wasn't that bad. Well, this kid was running away. He was escaping from a life in which he was a piece of property. And captivity was hereditary. So that property was hereditary. If a mother had children while she was a captive, her children were automatically captive. It didn't matter if the father was white, and there was a lot of that. There was a lot of that even here in Cheshire. Women were merchandise. Women were possessions, and therefore their captors believed they could do anything they wanted to these women. And so we do see a number of what was called at the time mulatto children being born. So even if the father was white and the mother was a captive, that child was still a captive. And even Charles Henry Stanley Davis, who was the historian for the town of Wallingford and wrote the book about the history of Wallingford, said they were indeed considered as members of the family. Now, we didn't have slave quarters like these at the Hermitage Plantation. For a long time, a lot of people believed that captives were given a room in the house. I know of a few museums that have created spaces within their museums to show where captives lived. Some do it really well, some not so well. Most of the time, captives were not given their own rooms with, furniture. In this case, this is Benjamin Hall's probate inventory. You can see he's inventorying. There's hay in the barn, an old side saddle, 2 corn baskets, a cider mill, a plow, a bed of furniture, and a Negro girl. This implies the way inventories were done, they were done room by room. This will tell you that that poor girl was living in the barn with all the equipment, and that we see over and over again. You see places where shackles are included in that inventory alongside the bed and the people. So this is going a little faster than I wanted. So the Gradual Abolition Act was passed in 1784 as a way to start the abolition process. The tide was turning at that point against hereditary captivity, and the General Assembly decided to start implementing this slowly. So a child born after March 1st of 1784 would be free at the age of 25. If you were born the day before that, you were enslaved for life. So a child born on March 1st would be enslaved until March 1st of 1809. That means slavery ended in 1784, right? No. That just means that a child born on February 28th of 1809 would be enslaved until February 28th of 1834. And this kind of went on. People born after 1784 weren't technically captives, but they weren't free either. So when you look at census records and you see all of these free people in the census records, you have to question how many of them were actually free and how many fell into this legal gray area where they were not actually captives, but they were not actually free either. These children did not have any of the freedoms that an indentured servant might have. They were still, for all intents and purposes, captives. They just had a date in the future that they would be free. And there were even some people in the state that tried to skirt those laws. And so when I learned about this, I kind of went, oh, so that's why the church that I grew up in, that was built in 1826, still had pews for slaves. And that's, that kind of suddenly just made sense to me, because in 1826, there were still people that were considered captives. So one of the pieces of this law was that people were required to register child servants. Any child born after March 1st of 1784 should be registered with the town, so that if there were any questions that came up later on, there would be some sort of proof that, hey, this kid was born on this date, so they are free on such and such a date. So in Cheshire, there's only four 4 children registered. There were definitely more children born, but only these 3 were registered, or 4 were registered, and they were all children born to parents who at least one of the parent was free. Here we've got Truman, Peter and Lucy Moore's child. Peter Moore was free. Actually, I think in all 3 of these cases, the fathers were free. Mothers are much harder to find in the records. So for those children, they didn't need manumission records. They just became free on whatever date was the given date. Because of that law, there were a number of people that decided, you know what, it's time to free the captives that I hold. In this case, here is a manumission record from Ezra Doolittle, who is freeing his captive named Jeremiah Elka. And this is from 1805. And we've got another from Matit Woodrow, who, this is the only record I have of this man. I have no idea who he belonged to prior to Abigail Merriman. I have no idea what happened to him. There's no death records. There's no birth records. I have no idea where this man came from. Betty is a little harder. There's no Betty Woodward, and Betty was a pretty common name. So another way people could get freedom was through military service in the Revolution. Many men were offered freedom explicitly. Others, there's a man named Philip that served in place of his captor. He came home from war with the understanding that he would be free. And when it came down to it, his captor said, no, I'm not freeing you. And that went to court. Others like Dick Freeman, Rural Africa, Sharp Liberty, Dick Bristol, who you'll hear a lot about in a minute, Caesar and Job Negro were all freed after the war. And so you can see here a list of some of the men. This is a list of the men in the Continental Service from 1781 from here in Cheshire. Rural Africa is one of my favorites, and you'll see why in a minute. He was probably born before 1760. I have no idea who his captor was. I know nothing of his life prior to his enlistment. You can see his name there on this muster or this payroll. But this is his son. This is actually a photograph of Hosea Rue, who was the son of Rural Africa and his wife Osei. He was born here in Cheshire on March 18th, 1783. And as you can see, he was the town crier in New Haven. So you can see here, he's the second line down, Hosa Africa, born March 18th, 1783. So to me, this allows you to actually look and see the face of a man who was born probably enslaved here in Cheshire. When the New Haven Museum got his picture and his town crier bell, the Saturday Chronicle wrote up this story about Hosea and talked, about his life in New Haven, which was, really kind of fun because it's about a man born here in Cheshire, but it was also kind of difficult because you can see that he didn't always have a great life. And Hosea had been freed when he turned 25. Even though he was born in 1783, he did become free at 25. And at that time period, when all of these folks are becoming free in 1810, 1820, a lot of conflict started. It led to an increase of tension and conflict between the Black and white communities. Much like we see today with immigrant communities, you see populations saying, oh, they're taking our jobs. The same thing happened 200 years ago. And so one of those ways conflict came out was another story that Edwin R. Brown tells. He says, one Sabbath, a Negro went to the barber's here, a thing which had been arranged by some of the young men, and had his hair nicely dressed for church, the barber putting a portion of tar in the hair preparation. This Negro was always known to sleep in church when present, and this Sabbath was not an exception. The Negro was soon asleep with his head on the back of the seat, and as the weather was warm, the tar very soon became sufficiently softened to stick the curly hair to the back of the seat. When he awoke, he found it not easy to raise his head, and in the sudden attempt which pulled severely his curly locks, he was led to cry out, "Oh, oh," in a shrieking tone that attracted the gaze of everyone in the church. He was afterwards arrested for this offense and was fined for disturbing the worship of the sanctuary. He was certainly a victim of misplaced confidence. So you can see that, not only were people having, the conflict came out in a variety of ways. And I just realized that we are getting way behind in time because I could just talk about this stuff for hours. So I'm going to run through Rhoda really quick. This is another incredible Connecticut story, or Cheshire story, I'm sorry. Rhoda was born free in Milford to a Spanish squaw in 1743. She was put out or indentured as a child to Adam Hurd by her mother. In 1748, Adam Hurd sold her to Mary Wheeler. In 1751, when she was about 8 or 9 years old, she was sold to Joseph Hall of Cheshire, who lived over on Wallingford Road. Hall took her into her home, where he educated and brought her up and retained her in her service for many years. She had a number of children born in the house of said Joseph, at least one of whom was called a mulatto. And the family claimed he was at great expense in taking care of, nursing, and bringing them up in the time that he lived with them, or they lived. And so I bring this up because we also have this idea that New Englanders would never sell children away from their mothers. So Rhoda had 4 children, Hampton, Lily, George, and Peter. And as you can see, as this goes through, each of the children was sold at different times to different people in different places. And George, I think, was sold the most. And he was also one of the youngest when he was sold. He was between 6 and 9. Peter, who had been sold between 4 and 6, stayed with his mother. So Hampton, after he was sold in early 1786, brought a suit against New Haven, or suit against Jonathan Hall in the county superior court, claiming he was free because his mother had been born free. The superior court ruled against him. He brought another suit a couple months later against the executors of Robert Martin, who he had been sold to, for assault, in which the question of being born free was raised again. This time, superior court ruled in his favor. Next thing we know, the whole thing is going to the General Assembly because the heirs of Joseph Hall, who was the one who had purchased Rhoda, didn't like the idea that Rhoda was now considered free by this superior court ruling, because that meant that all of the warranties, which were part of the bills of sale, when a seller sold a human being, they said, I own this person without any encumbrances, and I'm selling him to you without any encumbrances. If somebody's free and you're selling them, there's some issues. So the heirs of Hall were going back to the General Assembly saying, if she's free, then, there's this mess. And they were upset because they would be involved in total ruin and be stripped of all of their property by endless litigation for a transaction in which it's not intended that said Joseph was and is impossible for your petitioner to have been criminal or even blamable. So basically, our father didn't know, and you shouldn't ruin us because she thinks she's free. The whole thing went to the General Assembly. It went out to committees. And next thing you know, the children are freed. They're back at home. When 5 armed men with clubs came to the house of Dick and Rhoda to kidnap Lily back, to forcibly carry her back to the man who had purchased her in Wethersfield. At this point, and I have to look at my notes because I will get this wrong, the Connecticut Society for the Promotion of Freedom and the Relief of Persons Unlawfully Holden in Bondage, that's a name, was created and got involved in this case. And this was some of the leading minds of Connecticut. Simeon Baldwin, Reverend Jonathan Edwards, James Dana, Benjamin Trumbull, Ezra Stiles, Noah Webster, Tapping Reeve. So they get involved. L. Nathan Beach, who was a doctor here in Cheshire, and William Law were working on behalf of Rhoda and her family. So they're writing letters back and forth. The next thing you know, in 1792, Philip, Joseph Prynne, and John Webb, 3 African-American men from this area, go to Wethersfield armed with, I think it was staves and clubs, to take George and Lily back. This goes on for a couple of years. And then finally, in May of 1793, the General Assembly finds that Rhoda was indeed born free, which led to a whole bunch of people having to pay back money. The only person who did not get paid back in this was Dick Bristol, who had bought his wife's freedom. The man he bought Rhoda from, David Hotchkiss, conveniently disappeared, so could not take part in any of these court proceedings. So Dick was the only one who wasn't refunded the purchase price. So the aftermath, Rhoda died in 1799 at the age of 58 and is buried at Hillside. Hampton, who is the one who was also called a mulatto, died on January 2nd, 1813. There's no death records for Lily or George. I can't find any record of them anywhere. Peter Bellamy married a woman named Phyllis and moved to Southington, where they began a community of free Blacks called the Birches. And his descendants are still in Connecticut. And some of them have taken part in a few programs we've done here in Cheshire. As for Dick, this is the case that is most interesting to me because it has the most parallels to the world we now live in. So it's Dick in the case of the stolen turkeys. On September 15th of 1798, Zealous Bristol, who was a kind of pretentious white man that lived over on Coleman Road in what I think is actually the old Coleman farm, lost 2 or 3 turkeys. 2 days later, he went to Samuel Beach, the justice of the peace, and claimed that Dick stole the turkeys. He issued a warrant for Dick's arrest, Beach did, and went and arrested him. Zealous had 2 witnesses with him, Cornelius Cook and Selden Spencer, the sheriff, who accompanied Zealous to Dick's house where he found a turkey, a killed and dressed turkey under a barrel in the cellar. So by that evening, the evening of September 17th, the day he was arrested, Dick had been convicted of theft, ordered to pay damages of $4.50, taxed $3.92 for the costs of the court, fined $2 to the town treasury, and on failure was sentenced to be whipped at the whipping post, which Cheshire had a whipping post on the green, 8 stripes on the naked body. I'm sure the whipping post was used for plenty of white criminals in town as well. But it's still a horrific thought that happened here in Connecticut and here in Cheshire. Waterbury just removed their whipping post from the green 2 years ago. It had been used as a messaging post after, probably after the 1820s, 1830s. So the thing about this is there was a great deal of evidence that showed Dick was actually innocent. Samuel Hotchkiss and Samuel Hoadley heard Zealous admit that Dick was innocent. There were people that could testify that Dick was working with them all day long. Somebody had been in Rhoda's in the basement and knew that there was no turkey there that morning. And Cornelius Cook and Selden Spencer, the two that Zealous Bristol brought to find the turkey, finally admitted that they actually had been told exactly where the turkey would be found before they went. And so the more things change, the more they stay the same. Dick petitioned the General Assembly to allow a new trial. That went before the General Assembly at the May 14, 1799 session, where they ordered Justice Andrew Hall, which is Squire Hall, the one who, the barrel story. So they ordered him to hold a new trial at his home and give 6 days notice to Zealous Bristol. Dick appeared at Hull's for a new trial, only to learn that Zealous had actually never shown up because he had never been given notice. So Dick went back to the General Assembly again on May 14th of 1800 and once again asked the General Assembly to order Hull to hold a new trial. The General Assembly did order a new trial and said that Dick could get all of his costs back. Unfortunately, we have no idea whether that happened. There are no more petitions to the General Assembly, which kind of indicates that the town cleared him, but there are no Justice of the Peace court records left here in Cheshire, so we can't be sure of the outcome. We do know that Dick continued to live here, and my guess is Zealous Bristol probably continued to harass him. Throughout this whole thing, Zealous Bristol admitted that he knew Dick was innocent, but did this anyways. He did this because he could. My guess is there was some sort of relationship. Dick took the last name of Bristol, so he may have been enslaved by Zealous's family. I can't find any proof one way or another. But the whole idea that justice could be meted out so rapidly in this case. I mean, the day the complaint was made, he was arrested, he was fined, he was punished. Without counsel, without the chance to even get a bond, he had no opportunity to defend himself in any way. Kind of feels a lot like our criminal justice system today. People that are being told just to plead guilty because it's just easier that way, and you'll get less time, and it'll just be easier. And so when we start talking about this kind of history, when we start looking at cases like this that happened 200 years ago, over 200 years ago, and you say, nothing's changed, you can start to see this path. You can start to see why things don't change. It was okay back then, and it was okay 100 years later, and it has just become so much a part of how things are that this kind of thing is embedded in how those of us that are white and those of us that have the privilege not to worry about this kind of thing, we don't even think about it. It is just how it is. So part of what I do by talking about this history is point this stuff out and point out these lines and how nothing has changed and how we have to understand what happened in the past to make changes today. So Dick Bristol was still here in 1810 and died somewhere between 1810 and 1820, though no record of his death or burial exists. I'm going to kind of skip past this. Abolition versus anti-slavery versus colonization. The Reverend Sherlock Bristol, who is, I'm sure, in some way related to Zealous, was actually an abolitionist who was studying at Phillips Academy, Phillips Andover up in Massachusetts. It was a theology school, and the Congregational Church was actually paying for him to be there when he became one of the founding members of the Anti-Slavery Society, which were people that actually wanted to see the end to slavery. When the church found out that he was a founding member, they withdrew his funding because they were not okay with him being part of this anti-slavery society. Colonization society was much more about sending free Africans back to Africa. It was, all of these had more economic bases than any moral standing, moral imperatives. There was, in 1837, there was an abolition address in Meriden. There were a few people from Cheshire that went. Anyone that's done Spirits Alive a couple of years ago, what was her name? I think it was Eliza Benham, was one of the characters with an egg stain on her dress. She had been there and had rotten eggs thrown at her because a riot ensued in Meriden because of this lecture. All of that abolition ties into the myth of the Underground Railroad. For years growing up here, I was told, oh yes, Cheshire's part of the Underground Railroad. There were 3 houses that were part of the Underground Railroad. But in order to actually become part of the Underground Railroad, you have to have some sort of proof. And there's absolutely no evidence that any of the homes here in Cheshire had anything to do with the Underground Railroad. I believe there was probably some Underground Railroad movement prior to the 1830s, but I think it really took part in the Black community here in Cheshire. I've come across evidence of all sorts of ties between Cheshire and New Haven and Derby and Southington and Hartford that kind of indicate that there was a lot more Black participation in the Underground Railroad than there was white. But, you know, it's a feel-good story for the white community. So most of what we know about the Underground Railroad here in Connecticut is based around, you know, white conductors. This house is up on Jarvis, and the hidden area in the house actually probably was more to hide valuables from Native Americans because of the location of the house. This was, you know, wild indigenous country near the convergence of 2 Native American trails. So when it was built in the 1740s, it probably would have needed some sort of hiding space. So what is the legacy of slavery in Cheshire? We really don't have much left. There's the Lewis Freeman House, which was Prince Freeman's great grandson. He built this house over off of Oak Ave, somewhere around, I think it was 1890. There's Cuff Brook. Anyone that lives up on the Huckins Road, up behind the church that's up there, there's a brook called Cuff Brook, because Cuff was a freed African captive that lived at the bottom of Huckins and Marion Road. So the brook was named after him. And then, of course, there is the slave pew at the First Congregational Church, and they repainted this when it was rededicated last year. Giles Sampson, I'm going to quickly just skip over this. That's actually a picture of my mother at the house that she grew up in, which was built by Giles Sampson in 1870. He was a free African-American man who lived down on Wallingford Road. This is down on the 90-degree corner on Wallingford Road. So this is the house that my grandmother, my mother, and then I didn't grow up in it, but my family still lived there throughout my childhood. So I spent a ton of time in that house. So there's all these little connections in my life along the way. And And there you can see on the map where Giles Sampson. So the last quick one that I'm going to get through is the African burying place at Hillside Cemetery. This is near and dear to my heart. I'm sure many of you read my recent blog post about this. It took me a long time to write the post, but it needed to be done. The northeast corner of Hillside Cemetery is this African burying ground. And you can see this is an older picture because Princess Stone is still lying on the ground on the left. Next to him is Lewis. The broken stone next to him is Henry, his son. And the other broken stone is for Flora, Henry's second wife. This whole quarter-acre area was, until the 1980s, the final resting place of more than 100 Africans and African descendant people that lived here in Cheshire, that were enslaved here in Cheshire. And in the 1980s, the Cheshire Hillside Cemetery Association decided that this area was empty. Save for those 4 stones, this area was empty, and they began to sell plots. And I had been told by someone there that they stopped selling plots after a while because every time they dug a new grave, they found human remains. This angers me more than I ever realized. This is a place we're supposed to be respecting the dead. And here in this northeast corner, where the town pound once stood, we cannot respect the dead. We can't respect the dead that were buried there 100, 200, 300 years ago, and we can't respect the dead that have been buried there over the last 30 years. None of the families of the men or women that have been buried there over the last 30 years have been informed that there are already people there. And the families of the people that were already there have had no say in what happens to their loved ones' graves. So I'm not going to go further into this because as you can tell, I get a little emotional. So I will direct you to my blog post, jubrode.com, so you can read more about it. And, hopefully our town can start taking steps to rectify this situation. This is a piece of the grave hardware from Flora Freeman's grave. A mole got in there a couple of years ago, and Nick Bellantoni and Ruth Shapley Brown came down and we rescued a few pieces that the mole had dug up, like this piece of coffin hardware. So this is a list of all of the people that I have found records of that have been buried in that section in Hillside Cemetery. There are countless others. Jose Aru's mother, I know she died here. There's no record of her death or burial. There's no record of Dick Bristol's burial. There's no record of Perot or his wife. The list goes on. I can probably come up with another 50 to 60 names of people that I know lived here in Cheshire that there is no records of. There's no burial records. So with that, I think I probably went over. I apologize. And I hope people learn something. Again, I apologize. It's much harder to do on Zoom, but I guess I'll.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your detailed research and your presentation. If we were in person, I know that everybody would be giving you a huge round of applause. My name is Emily Mills, and this is...
I'm Saparja. I'm Saparja Nag.
And we will now move into the discussion portion of our presentation. So we'll open up the floor to you all who are viewing this presentation to ask questions. We only have a limited amount of time, so we'll get to as many as possible. You can submit questions via email. You should have all received an email from us, or you can send them in the chat. They're all anonymous. And speaking of which, I think we already got one during the presentation. Someone asked about when you mentioned male captives being released through military service. Which war were you speaking about, Christine?
Can you repeat that? You kind of broke up. You kind of hung on that question.
Apologies. When you mentioned that male captives being released through military service, which war were you referring to?
Revolutionary War.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and several of those men are claimed by Wallingford, but they were actually enslaved here in Cheshire, so.
Okay, and we also had another question about the Doolittles that you're speaking about that owned many slaves in Cheshire. Is that the same Doolittle that refers to Doolittle Elementary School? I think some people are wondering.
I don't know specifically, but yes, it's the same Doolittle family. The Doolittles were a rather large family here in town. So I don't really know what branch, because I'm still not sure exactly what Doolittle the school was named after. But
okay, great. So please keep asking questions. If it's content questions that Christine herself can answer, that's great. I think some of the discussion that we want to have is also just kind of a broader discussion. So we're going to start with a few questions that were come up with by RAR, which is the high school club that kind of helped to plan this event. And so they've had many discussions about your research, your blog posts. And so we were kind of interested to hear the resources that you use to kind of learn about racism. And you've mentioned some kind of modern issues and how this, it's all one big issue. But what types of resources and how have you taken the initiative to learn about systemic racism today?
So I tend to do it, again, looking through history and having a lot of discussions. One of my coworkers and dear friends, Kevin Johnson, is my sounding board. So through the years, I have had really deep discussions with him about just all different forms of racism. He and I have talked about the cemetery and, the whole idea that we as white folks don't have to worry about our family members getting dug up. That's just not something we have to worry about because it's just not going to happen. But to Kevin, that's something he's aware of. That's something that many African Americans who, there are cemeteries popping up all over the South right now that, have been disturbed, they just pulled a whole bunch of headstones out of a river in Virginia from a cemetery in Washington. So it's through discussions like that. And it's through looking at history, looking at the town records, looking at court records. At the state library, we recently got a grant to look at New Haven County court records with a specific eye to looking at communities of color. So we'll be really kind of digging into those court records, which helps my research immensely. Because in those court records, you see so much that, if you swap some of the language, it's today, just like Dick Bristol's case. How many cases like that, change a few words, a few circumstances are being tried in courts today. The whole idea that there was a law on the books, a white man caught stealing was subject to 20 lashes, while a black man caught stealing the exact same thing would get 30. That echoes back to, drug laws. How many people of color are in prison for things that a white person could just get away with? So it's really digging through and seeing the parallels is how I approach it. And then having lots of really hard, frustrating for my friends of color conversations. Don't be afraid to ask questions. If you're honestly approaching the subject of racism and bias, if you're coming at it from an honest place and asking honest questions, your friends of color are not gonna turn you away for asking those questions.
Thank you. And we have questions coming in through the chat. Again, please feel free to send them over. We'll get to as many as possible. We have a question about your research. This person says, your research is amazingly thorough. How were you able to conduct such amazing research from such a long time ago?
It's really patience and just being willing to slog through page after page after page of records. And I've been doing it for 15 years at least, and there's still more out there. So I'm currently working with a colleague from the Concerned Parents of Color of West Hartford, who I hope is in the audience. And, I'm introducing them to just what a slog it is, but it's worth it because you find these amazing stories, and you get to bring these people back to life. These people who were forgotten when they were alive, whose stories didn't matter enough to historians, to the people that kept records around. So it's a passion, and I love being able to find these stories and share them.
Yeah, so kind of along with what you're saying, why do you think these stories are forgotten? Do you think that's intentional, or do you think it's more of just a passage of time?
It's a little bit of both. It goes back, the earlier stories, the men and women of color that were held captive were property. They didn't matter. Their stories didn't matter. So nobody bothered to write them down. And these communities, in many of these communities, they weren't literate. They didn't have the ability to write down their own stories. However, that doesn't mean they're gone. There's within the African-American community, there is a strong tradition of oral history, but we've come so far that there's not a lot of trust between the white institutions of memory, museums, libraries, which really have been about collecting white history. And there's not a lot of trust there. So, currently museums are making a huge effort to reach out to communities of color, to say, this is your history, is our history, and we do want to preserve it. So that's something I'm really excited about. But I don't think in the past that these stories were of interest. Edwin R. Brown is actually kind of unique in that he did record some of these anecdotal stories. Most towns, I don't think, have that level of storytelling in their histories.
And I think we're going to have to start to wrap up, but I wanted to get to this one last question. We have a question that is, what takeaways would you like people to have after hearing your excellent presentation? And how do you hope that young people will apply this information to their own lives? I know that we have a lot of students on this call.
So I think I want you to take away that this history is there. It's there for you to find. It's there for you to recognize. It's always been there. And by understanding this history, you can understand the future. There's a joke about the historian's plight is to watch history repeat itself. And so we can stop that from happening if we understand, what happened in the past. If we can look back and say, this is an intergenerational trauma. Those stories that I told of, horrendous acts being perpetrated against African Americans here in Cheshire, that probably affected those boys and men and their children and their children's children and their children's children's children. If we recognize that sort of intergenerational trauma, if we can look back and look at this history and say, how has that affected the subsequent generations? We get to today and go, I understand now. And it helps us to move on, I think. So I think as a takeaway, I hope you look at history like that. I hope you understand the relevance that history has on your life. So when you're sitting in history class, think about the parallels. No matter what kind of history it is, what are the parallels that you can draw in your life, in our community, in our nation, in our world today?
Fantastic. So
anyone that has questions, please feel free to email me or message me on my blog. And I hope to get more blog posts done. I have a whole bunch in the works. I just get sidetracked with other projects. Thank you all for having me. I'm really happy to be able to do this and share this. And I look forward to further conversations.
Definitely. So on that note, there were a lot of questions that came in and we weren't able to get to them all, unfortunately. So please reach out to us, the CCC. As we mentioned, you should have received an email from us previously, and reach out to Christine, read her blog. It's really excellent research. It's really well written. It can be difficult to read at times, and I think that's part of having these conversations. So just to finish off, we want to thank RAR and all of the students that are here today, as well as their faculty advisors, Ms. Dawn DeMayo and Mr. Greg Klodnicki. Thank you so much for helping us put this together, and also getting the word out. We are overwhelmed and overjoyed with the turnout tonight. We actually ran out of capacity on the Zoom link, so we had to send people to the YouTube, which we weren't expecting. So this is amazing. So thank you so much, Christine, for your research and your continuous educational efforts. It's really telling how much you care about this and how much effort you put into it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Like I said, we encourage you to check out her blog. The article on the African burying place is difficult to get through, but it's really quite informative. So we encourage you all to do that. And also, we hope you learned something tonight and you take a moment to reflect on it. It's not just about taking in information, it's about reflecting on it as well. So as Marissa said in the chat, we're going to be sending out a survey. And that survey is for any lingering thoughts you may have, and also just for us to collect some information for ongoing events. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Christine, for joining us tonight. And everybody stay healthy, stay safe, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.